Being followed. Probably one of the most scariest experiences anybody could have in their life. Having somebody behind you just watching you, following your every pace, until waiting for just the right moment to strike. And here, I have 5 of the most scariest stories of being followed. Enjoy, everybody. A few semesters ago, I was taking a class that ended around 10 p.m. After that, I usually spent about 30 minutes cleaning up the lab, and then I had a 30-minute drive, so I was usually home around 11 or shortly thereafter. One evening, as I pulled into my neighborhood, I noticed a large pickup truck with a trailer sitting at a stop sign on the street, perpendicular to mine. There was a woman standing outside of the car talking to someone. Maybe the driver or maybe a neighbor. This immediately struck me as odd because my neighborhood is a tiny town of only a few hundred people, most of whom have young kids. This means that nobody is out of the house after maybe 9 p.m. and certainly not walking around and talking. As I drove past, the woman walked into the other side of the truck and got in. As I pulled up to the curb in front of my house, I noticed the truck had followed me. They pulled partly into the driveway of my next door neighbor. That neighbor doesn't have a truck and isn't usually up that late because of the kids, but I wasn't too worried yet. They had moved in only a month or so earlier, so I figured they must be borrowing a truck and trailer for a friend to finish up the move. I walked quickly across my yard and locked the door behind me like I always do. It was only a few seconds later when the doorbell rang. Still thinking that my neighbor was the one in the truck, I assumed he had seen me drop something in the yard and wanted to let me know. Now comes the stupid part. My boyfriend was in the back part of the basement at the time, and the doorbell isn't audible down there. To get to the basement, I had to walk right past the front door, which has a pane of glass in it. I would be visible to whoever was outside, so instead of letting him know that someone was at the door, I just answered it. It wasn't my neighbor. There was a woman in her 30s standing on my front step. The truck had backed out of my neighbor's driveway and was now parked in the middle of the street, running with its lights off. Standing around the truck in my yard were 4 or 5 big burly men slowly walking towards me. Red flags went off instantly. "Hi," the woman said. "We're here to see those couches from Craigslist. Can we come in?" She took a step towards me, but by then I knew something was up. "You've got the wrong house," I said. I slammed the door as hard as I could and locked it. At this point, my boyfriend had heard me talking to someone and flipped on a basement light that was visible from the front yard. Up until then, the house had looked dark and empty from the street. I ran downstairs and told him the short version, and we each grabbed a weapon. When it was clear the people weren't coming back, I called the sheriff, and they took a full report and drove around the small town to see if the truck was still around. I really hoped that they would see these folks in another house nearby loading couches, because that would mean it was an honest mistake. Just to be sure, I checked Craigslist myself. As I had feared, there were no couches for sale within 20 miles of me. I later learned that this was a common MO of criminals. Stake out a quiet neighborhood and wait until a single woman comes home alone. Have a female accomplice, make up an excuse to get her to open the door, and bam! I don't know if they just wanted to rob the house or worse, but I'm very glad I wasn't home alone. And to this day, I don't answer the door unless I'm armed. So crazy Craigslist people, let's not meet again. I don't live in the best neighborhood. It's honestly pretty ghetto, but I've lived in the ghettos for most of my life, and I've never been afraid or had any real problems. Also, I am a male in his early 20s who's 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. I never thought something like this would happen to me. Anyways, on to the encounter. It's mid-afternoon, not dark in the slightest, and I decided to take a walk to the corner store to pick some stuff up. The walk is about 1 mile, so it's not too far at all. The corner store is at the corner of a little shopping mart that has some restaurants and a general store. In order to get to the mart, you have to walk by an alley where the shops keep their large trash bins. Usually a homeless person or two sleep here. I was on the phone as I walked by the alley. This time there was a man a few feet into the alley dressed in mostly black. We looked at each other for maybe a second and I thought nothing of it, so I walked by. I continued a bit more and stopped in front of the general store. As the phone call was sort of getting more important, I leaned up against a pillar in front of the store on its sidewalk to talk for a bit, and I noticed the man walked by and stopped by 2 feet past the other side of the pillar. As I mentioned before, I grew up in the ghetto and I immediately felt something was off, and I hung up my phone and put it in my pocket in case he planned on grabbing it and running. I knew something was wrong. So I decided to walk across the parking lot into this little greasy area near the sidewalk, somewhere no one would ever walk to. This was to see what he did. A few moments later, he starts to walk in my general direction. At this point, I knew something was up, and this guy either wanted to rob me or hurt me. So again, I walk across the parking lot in the other direction and stand in front of the corner store. Moments go by, and he again starts coming towards me. So I enter the store. He gets to the storefront, but he never enters. He just leans up against the store. He can't see me as he's leaning up against it, looking the other direction, a few feet from the store's door, but I can see him. I don't think he realized I knew something was up. I ended up staying in that store for about 10 minutes, just waiting, pretending to be on the phone. He just waits outside the store for the entire time, clearly waiting for me to exit. After the 10 minutes, he seems to get nervous and starts walking back towards the alley. He gets about halfway when I exit the store and starts heading towards the street corner, so I can cross and gain some distance while still seeing if he does anything. This is when I get really afraid. He notices that I left the store and starts walking towards me. The crosswalk lights up and I get about halfway across the street when I look back for the first time since leaving the corner store, and I notice he is at the light ready to cross as well. I get across and I turn around as he walks a few feet into the crosswalk. For the first time, I just start staring at him. As soon as he gets close enough, I decided I'd start yelling at him, but after a few feet into the crosswalk, he turns around and starts heading towards the alley, and I felt a great relief. I cross the street again, and in another direction, I look back and notice he has walked past the alley and is heading down the street towards where I live, and I see him start talking to some other guy that walked from behind some wall near the street, but I can't really tell what's going on as they're probably about a football field away. I end up walking down the street a bit so we could not see each other, and I waited about 20 minutes before walking home, which I never saw him again. I have no idea what he wanted or why he was following me, but it was very clear that he was. The entire encounter was probably about 20 minutes in total. He didn't look totally homeless, and I have never seen him before, but he has made me afraid to go to that corner store again, as he was definitely motivated to get close to me alone. I just never gave him the time. After speaking with someone about this, I realized I should have called the cops as soon as I was sure he was following me, and in the future I will, but this had never happened to me before, and I am just glad it ended peacefully. You know how there are some events that are so significant that make such an impression on you that years, even decades later, the memories can play like a video in your mind. Maybe it's the anniversary of this event coming up that has made me remember it so clearly. It was 20 years ago that I found myself involved in an event that forever changed how I viewed my personal safety. In the fall of 1995, I was renting a room in a beautiful, historic Victorian house in a small town in Northern California where I attended a university. I was just about to complete a degree in history and did not have much time for a social life. I was a bit of an introvert. Although I did have a good group of friends, I'd say that I was a pretty easygoing person, and maybe it was because I had a very sheltered upbringing that I was pretty oblivious to the idea that I could ever be the victim of physical harm by a stranger. My college town at the time was a laid-back, relaxing place to be. The walkability score was off the charts, the atmosphere encouraged physical, challenging outdoor pursuits, and there was never a lack of activities to participate in or places to explore. I walked or biked nearly everywhere I went, usually up and down steep hills and thousands of stairs. It was also a fairly safe place. I don't remember hearing about any serious physical altercations. People were usually pretty kind, and nearly everyone I knew walked around campus and the town after dark fairly frequently without trouble. I had never found myself in any sort of dangerous situation until one night. I had been at the Gourmet Hall computer lab working on another paper for one of my history classes. The lab was a large room with around 14 rows of tables and 8 computers in each row. There were 2 entrances along the right side of the room, one at the front and one at the back. I had printed a rough draft of the paper that I had proofread and marked up to refer to as made corrections on the computer. I had spent several hours getting the paper polished enough to hand in the next day. It was late, I was tired and ready to go home. I removed my disk from the drive, put my things away, and closed out the computer. I hefted my backpack, rough draft in hand, and I walked toward the front entrance. Along the wall between the 2 entrances was a line of benches where other students sat, waiting for a computer to free up. and between the benches and the door was a receptacle dedicated to white paper trash. I met the eyes of a young man sitting next to a bin where I threw in my rough draft, and I smiled at him. As I walked out of the door, I scarcely noted his appearance, and I started off on the 10-minute walk to my house. The half-mile walk from campus to my house began on a small street in front of Gormain Hall. The street ended in a paved pathway and continued as a series of staircases that led down a steep forested hill. At the bottom of the stairs, the pathway could either lead you up to the sidewalk alongside Woodside Boulevard that fronted the freeway, or it turned down toward an underpass that crossed under the Woodside and then came out as a footbridge that crossed the freeway. The entire portion of the walk was well lit, but once across the freeway, I was in a quiet, dark neighborhood with few street lights and 3 blocks between me and my house. I always walked those blocks quickly at night. Regardless of how safe my town was, I still usually maintained some awareness of my surroundings when I walked around at night. Just to be prudent, even so, I didn't recall sensing anything out of the ordinary on the walk home, and certainly didn't notice anyone following me. I reached my house, walked up the steps, and into the front room. The front door of that entrance latched shut, but could never fully lock, even if latched from the inside. The door and the lock were so flimsy that it wouldn't take much effort to push it open. We never had any reason for concern about that before. I walked past the kitchen and down the long hall, down to my room, and unlocked the bolt. The only real security in our house started at our rooms. Each entrance to the individual rooms rented by students had good stout doors with solid deadbolt locks. I unloaded my gear, took my shoes off and jacket, and sat down to rest and think about what I wanted to make for dinner. Spaghetti again? Oh, the life of a student. I was still lounging around and putting my things away, several minutes later when David, one of my housemates, knocked on my semi-cracked door and said, "Hey, Jiva, there's a guy out here asking for you." I frowned and then sort of grinned. I immediately thought it must be either one of my friends, Ethan or Kyle, coming over to visit and trying to play a joke of some sort. David knew both of those guys and would have just let them into my room. I left my room and headed down the hall. David had already gone back into his room and shut the door. I could hear him blaring Beck's Loser for the millionth time. As I came down the hall, I wondered who it was going to be and what I was going to say. I was still grinning slightly as I came around the corner and encountered a vaguely familiar guy, but still unknown to me, standing at the front of my door, which was swung wide open. He was Caucasian, had short dark brown hair, slightly wavy, and was wearing a nylon-type jacket with a t-shirt underneath, and jeans and sneakers. Very nondescript. I don't remember exact details, but somehow I recall that his jacket was red with white stripes on the cuffs. My immediate thought was, did I leave something at the computer lab? What is he doing here? Because standing in front of me was the guy who had been sitting next to the white paper trash bin at the computer lab. I was a bit dumbfounded. As soon as he saw me, he asked in a rather strong, assertive voice,
"Are you Jiva Black Raven?"
At this point I had stopped grinning. I was frowning slightly and nodded my head in an answer. He instantly hardened his approach and began chastising me about the use of other people's garbage dumpsters. He was grousing and ranting about how irritated he was over people's thinking that he could use his dumpster to dispose of their own garbage. He asked if I knew if this was illegal. He told me it hadn't been difficult to track me down because he'd found my name and address on a piece of mail that I had thrown into a dumpster with the rest of my garbage. He went on and on, becoming more agitated with every word. I was completely confused. At the back of my head, I still realized that I had just seen him at the computer lab, but the guy just kept spouting his anger. I finally gathered my thoughts around his accusation that I had at some point taken my garbage and placed it in some theoretical dumpster that belonged to him. As he was ranting at me, I was trying to puzzle this situation out. I looked toward the windows in the west side of the house. Right below those windows were the garbage cans where I did deposit my trash. I started talking through his blithering. "Wait, so you're saying that I used your dumpster to dispose of my garbage? Or has someone else gone through my garbage and thrown it in your dumpster?" I asked this with some unbelievability to it, and was answered by his exploding outrage.
"No, you've been using my dumpster as your personal garbage bin. I don't like it. I'm not going to allow it, and you're going to come with me right now to clean it up."
I began shaking, whether in fear or anger, or maybe both. This was just too bizarre. He wanted me to go with him voluntarily? I shook my head and said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not going anywhere with you." But that just seemed to incense Garbage Guy further, and he stepped forward and grabbed me by the forearm. obviously intending to drag me along with him. Thankfully, he wasn't a very big guy, and I went totally berserk and started screaming and flailing and kicking at him as loud and as hard as I could. He definitely didn't expect that, and pretty soon, David came rushing out of his room to see what all the ruckus was about. The guy then disentangled himself from me and went off running out of the door, down the steps and then into the street. I didn't bother to see which direction he was headed. I was nearly in a state of collapse. I was so overcome with adrenaline that I couldn't collect myself physically, and David helped me to sit down on the couch. As David slammed the useless door shut, I began to tell him what had happened. I was very bewildered as I recounted to him the preceding events. I could not at first make any sense of how that guy knew who I was and where this garbage dumpster was located. And then it came back to me that I had seen that guy at the computer lab, right as I was leaving to walk home. Then I was struck with the realization that my name had been on that paper that I had thrown into the bin that he was sitting next to. He'd pulled that paper out of the bin, followed me all the way to my house, and waited several minutes concocting an excuse to come knocking at my door. I found it incredibly creepy. David urged me to call the police to file a suspicious person report, which I did. The woman I spoke with took down the account I gave her, but sympathetically related that nothing more could be done unless he overtly committed a crime. I understood. I just felt it was important that someone in authority knew this had happened in case it happened again. I went back to my room and made doubly sure that the windows were locked securely and that the shades were tightly drawn. I was suddenly so thankful that that big old Victorian I lived in was built on a tall basement foundation that put the bottom of my windows about 8 feet off the ground. I still had an awful feeling that that garbage guy knew which windows were mine, and I imagined him standing out in the yard watching me. I realized that I hadn't had any dinner and that I didn't care. I was so anxious and freaked out that I no longer had an appetite. I think I checked my deadbolt more than a few times that night. The lack of a secure front door really began to bother me. I began obsessing over all the implications of this guy's visit to my house. He could just come to our house anytime he wanted to. I wondered if he realized this. I also wondered why he'd done this to me. Had he been watching me? Had he seen me and considered me an easy mark? I was very slightly built and petite in college, and I know I gave off the impression that I was passive and introverted to anyone who didn't know me well. He obviously didn't realize that not only was I not a shrinking violet, but I also had a larger male housemate who wouldn't stand for his behavior. Maybe his lack of recon was why he thought he could pull this off. Then I wondered, pull what off? What had he be intending to do? What was the end result? Did he think I would calmly agree to go with him to this mysterious garbage dumpster? To what ends? The speculation made me sick to my stomach. Had he done this with other girls before? Had his attempts been successful? Successful at what? I had the worst time sleeping that night. I got ready for class the next morning in deep anxiety. I was also very angry. I had never had anyone try to physically harm me before, and I wanted his blood. I made it through my day, and as usual, went back to Gourmet Hall to work on more papers and class projects. I had been working at a computer towards the back of the room for about a half hour before I looked up and noticed Garbage Guy walking into the lab through the front door. Thank the gods for oversized 90s monitors. I hid behind mine until he sat down at a computer 4 rows in front of me and had turned his back in my direction. I didn't think he'd seen me. As quickly and stealthily as I could, I closed up what I'd been working on, packed up my things, and slipped out of the back door, keeping my eyes on the back of his head the entire time. He was wearing the same jacket he'd been wearing the night before and the same jeans and sneakers. I carefully noted his description and went immediately to the campus police department, which was luckily a short walk down the hill from Gourmet Hall in the student service building. I was feeling quite foolish since he had only frightened me. I had no marks on my arm where he'd grabbed me, and he did not strike me at all. I hoped I had hurt him more than he had me. I wasn't sure if talking to campus police would make any difference, but I felt it was worth alerting them to my experience, if only to contribute to further investigations of other incidents should that be necessary. I walked into the campus police office and stated that I needed to talk to someone about a strange incident that had occurred the previous evening. The woman at the front counter led me into a room with a table and asked me to sit down. She returned with a campus police officer, and I began my story, being careful to relate to everything I could remember. I included that I had made a suspicious person report last night. They maintained carefully blank expressions but nodded periodically, and I felt that maybe I was not so foolish. I ended by giving the description of the guy up at the Gourmet Hall computer lab and said that he was there right now. The officer asked me a few further questions about the guy and his behavior, and then said that he was going to make a quick trip up to the Gourmet Hall to see if he can get a good look at the guy I described. While he was away, I spoke further with the woman who sympathized with me and reassured me that coming to them was a good idea, since the guy was obviously spending time on campus. After several minutes, the police officer returned, and with a look of grim confirmation on his face, he stated that he was certain he'd spotted the guy I described, and although he couldn't relate any details, that guy was known to them as a problem, and that I wasn't the first person to make a complaint about him. The officer then proceeded to give me some excellent guidance about completely changing my habits using the buddy system, differing the times I spent in places and changing those places altogether. I know that currently, this would be seen as an insulting and pitiful substitute for holding an attacker accountable for his actions. However, legally, there wasn't anything they could do to Garbage Guy. My strategy would be to make it difficult, if not impossible, for him to track me if he got the inclination, and that suited me fine. The officer gave me the card of a campus escort service that I could contact from any of the free-to-use phones that were connected through the inter-campus phone system to request a ride to my house, especially after dark. The officer and his assistant were very kind and patient with me in ways that no police officer has ever been since, and they took me very seriously, which I was extremely grateful for. I thanked them profusely and took their advice to heart. I never saw Garbage Guy again. Several years later, I read the book The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule about the investigation of the Ted murders in Washington State and the author's acquaintance with serial killer Ted Bundy. I immediately recognized that these two men used similar strategies in their attempts to disarm and trick women into leaving an area of safety to go with them. Speculating about Garbage Guy's intentions still chills my bones to this day. Hey guys, thank you all for watching my video. I'm so sorry that this video took forever to get out there. The cold monster flew in and got me sick, and along with that came a whole load of other shit that just derailed my YouTube stuff. But on a little side note here, the first two tracks in my stories were not from royalty-free music. No, they were from my buddy at the Blotto Studios, a very good YouTube channel with a lot of great music. I highly recommend you guys check him out. And if you're an upcoming creepypasta guy or a narrative that does scary stories, send him a message, tell him I sent you, and I'm pretty sure he can help you out with all the good stuff. Now, on more important note here, my channel just recently surpassed 100 subscribers, and I can't tell you how grateful I am, guys. It really means a lot that you guys like these videos and watch them and comment on them. I always love seeing you guys interact in the comment board. It's really nice to get personal feedback as well as good criticism. And I have to thank Killer Orange Cat too, man. You're freaking awesome. Your YouTube channel is awesome. And I'm really happy that you're really one of the first people that ever really commented on my channel and helped me out a little bit. So seriously, guy, thank you so much for that. And just thank you to everybody, really. Thank you for supporting this channel. And you know what? If you guys have any scary stories at all, email me and I'll read them and I'll narrate them in one of my upcoming videos. Do that so we could all keep the copyright strike at bay. That's been going around forever lately, and my goodness. But anyways, guys, if you guys have any scary stories, like I said before, email me. I will narrate them. And well, guys, just remember, the best ideas always come out of nightmares.